Welcome back. Our focus today is on the Gilded Age, the period after the Civil War, and on two literary phenomena of the era, realism and naturalism. Then we'll talk briefly about a few authors. But since literature is just an expression of an era's social, political, and cultural atmosphere, let's review what that was like in the Gilded Age. What was happening then?
After the North won the Civil War, there was industrialization, which led to a rapid growth of the cities, fueled by people moving in from the countryside and immigrants from overseas.
Someone has been paying attention in history classes. Exactly. And all this industrialization, urbanization, and immigration had what effect on literature?
Beats the hell out of me.
Well, in addition to creating great wealth, industrialization and such social transitions also generally lead to great disruptions and problems. Wealth is not distributed evenly, and moving from countryside to city means setting up new social networks. But that takes time, and they don't always work smoothly at first. To change the bad conditions that resulted, people first need to be aware of them and see them for themselves, and that is where realism comes in. In other words, realism was often tied to efforts at social reform. Of course, from a literary standpoint, it was also a reaction to Romanticism. For an example of that, see Mark Twain's James Fenimore Cooper's Literary Offenses, in which he attacks Cooper for very unrealistic, literally impossible events he portrays in his novels. But because realism was tied to social reform, characteristics of realism include an emphasis on everyday experience, the featuring of everyday people and the common man, and a focus on character rather than on plot in the stories. Some examples of realists in America in the Gilded Age are Henry James, William Dean Howells, and, of course, Mark Twain. A branch of realism at this time was naturalism, but I'm sure you've learned all this already in school. So you tell me, what is it, and give me an example.
That Emerson guy was one, right? He wrote that essay on nature or something?
In fact, no, that's a common mistake. Emerson was much more a romantic, someone who believed that if you understood nature, you understood God. God was essentially revealed in nature. Naturalists, on the other hand, saw man as a product of nature, but nature itself was indifferent to man. Take a look at this short poem by Stephen Crane as an example. The universe, in other words, doesn't care a whit about humans. It just is. We try to put meaning into nature and the world around us, but it doesn't work that way. Do you recognize the 19th century thinker behind all of this?
Must have been that Darwin dude. After all, he was a naturalist, wasn't he?
Spot on. Biologists are the real naturalists here. And after he published On the Origin of Species in 1859, these ideas eventually changed everything about how we think about the world around us. People are shaped by the natural forces around them as we all adapt to the world around us. In evolution, it is those who adapt best who survive. Naturalists believed in determinism, that man is shaped by his environment and his behavior controlled by his heredity. In effect, we are no different than animals.
I seen that at that party last night.
Our behavior is controlled both by our inner desires and by outer forces.
Yep, that was last night.
Keep all of these things in mind when you read the stories for this week, and we can focus on that in the seminars. But for the rest of today, I just want to give some brief background information on three naturalists: Ambrose Bierce, Jack London, and Stephen Crane. Ambrose Bierce was born in Indiana in 1842. Like Mark Twain, he was swept up by the Civil War, joining the North when it began. But unlike Twain, who fled west after 1 week, Bierce stayed and fought for the full 4 years. After the war, though, he did the same as Twain and ended up in San Francisco working as a journalist. He stayed there for most of the rest of his life, unlike Twain, who moved back east after a few years. Despite a somewhat successful career, he led a fairly unhappy life. Both sons died before him, and he divorced his wife, not a terribly common thing at the time. The unhappiness is reflected in much of his writing, and earned him the nickname Bitter Bierce. Take a look at these examples from the Devil's Dictionary, a compilation of definitions taken from the column he published in a San Francisco newspaper. His cynicism, misanthropy, and wit are hard to overlook. He wrote horror and satire stories, and at times his writing can seem a bit forced or stilted, but not when it comes to his writings about war. His realistic depictions of war can be traced back to his experiences in the Civil War, when he fought in some of the bloodiest battles of the conflict. These can be found in a collection of short stories entitled Tales of Soldiers and Civilians, published in 1891. No one knows exactly when or how he died. He disappeared into Mexico in 1913 at the age of 71 and joined up with Pancho Villa's Revolutionary Army. It is thought that he died in a battle in 1914, but no body was ever found. As a journalist in San Francisco, Bierce personally knew Mark Twain, and later another famous West Coast writer, Jack London. London was born in San Francisco in 1876. He grew up poor and worked many jobs as a fisherman, sailor, laborer, and gold seeker. His experiences sailing in the North Pacific and hunting for gold in the Yukon influenced many of his famous stories, including the Sea Wolf, White Fang, and the Call of the Wild. Because of this, he is often associated with Alaska and the Yukon and thought of as a rugged individualist. But London embodied many of the contradictions of the era. He was a rugged individualist who fought his way through life, but he was also an ardent socialist. He twice ran for mayor of Oakland, California as a socialist, but lost both times. Darwinism and socialism just don't go together, a fact even Marx and Engels recognized later. For all those contradictions, though, London is still best remembered for his portrayals of nature. But it is never a romanticized version of nature. Nature is beautiful, but also harsh and indifferent to people. London was a prolific and very disciplined writer who turned out 1,000 words a day for the last 20 years of his short life. He died at age 40, with hard living and alcohol probably playing a role in its brevity.
In its what?
Shortness, his dying young, which is also true of our next writer, Stephen Crane, who died before he was 30. Born in 1871 in New Jersey, Crane was born into a wealthier family than London, but his life was in many ways just as adventurous, though he didn't have to do the physical work that London did. Crane dropped out of college at age 20 and became a freelance journalist and writer in New York. Here he published Maggie of the Streets, the story of a young woman who moved to the city and was forced by circumstances into prostitution. It fits into our description of realism because
it encouraged social reform?
Bingo! Also realistic was a Civil War novel he wrote right after it, The Red Badge of Courage. Veterans who read it claimed it captured exactly the fear that combat produces, though Crane himself had never been a soldier. And it's naturalistic because what does a man do when confronted with the confusion of battle and the threat of death?
He runs like hell.
Bingo again! Plus, the soldiers in the story have no control over their own fate, another mark of naturalism. Also, the animals and other elements of nature seem totally unconcerned with the human endeavors on the battlefield. He later traveled in the American West, then became a war correspondent in Greece during the Greco-Turkish War, and then Cuba in the Spanish-American War. He lived briefly in England and then died in Germany of tuberculosis. Some say he would have had the impact of Hemingway had he lived longer. His short, straightforward writing, both in poetry and in prose, anticipated Hemingway's journalistic style. Both were, after all, newspaper writers. So keep all of that in mind as you read these short stories on realism and naturalism, and we'll discuss it in the seminars. Otherwise, that's it for now. Next time we continue with the Gilded Age and focus on regionalism and the rags to riches stories.